timely, insightful, discussion and analysis of economic trends and markets. From Southern California to Sacramento, featuring business and political leaders, unique field reports. From Orange County and the campus of Chapman University, this is the Chapman Business Report.
And welcome back to the Chapman Business Report, our weekly look at business, financial markets, and a special focus on the regional economies of Southern California. I'm Pete Weitzner. I head up the broadcast journalism program here on the campus at Chapman University, a couple of blocks behind me at the Dodge College of Film and Media Arts. And in that direction is the Chapman Law School, which I guess almost since its inception, Tim Canova has had, or maybe a few years in, has had Professor Tim Canova, professor of economic law, but plays in a realm far beyond that, recently named by U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders to the Advisory Committee on Federal Reserve Reform. As I mentioned, his specialty, economic law, will mostly focus on this issue of the Federal Reserve, what it does, what it's evolved to do, what he thinks it should do, this committee on how to reform the Fed. Also some very interesting thoughts overall on the economic collapse and what we should do or should have done. A lot of historical perspective on our debt. So interesting topics with lawyer by trade, but economic specialist Tim Canova. Very much thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
I gave a little of a background, maybe just a little bit more. I mentioned a lawyer by trade. How did you get to this point where you joined Chapman Law School and now, as I mentioned, focus on economic issues?
Well, I practiced law in New York City with a large firm for a few years and then went into teaching. I was a tenured professor at the University of New Mexico when Chapman recruited me, and I've been out here since 2004.
And as I mentioned, you're a professor of economic law. When we met years ago, one of your big passions then was Mexico, which still has many issues, but has just fallen a little below the top issues. You talked about a Marshall Plan for Mexico. How about this, both this passion and obviously this knowledge base to speak on economic issues?
Well, you know, my interest in Mexico has not waned, but it's not just Mexico. I think all over the world we see countries that are facing the same problems. There's an epidemic
and now us.
And now us. There's an epidemic of youth unemployment in the world, and it hit Mexico and other countries before us, but it's here on our shores at this point.
So the wellspring for you comes from a lot of ills. I know we talk a lot about income inequality. You're going to want to talk about and corporate bailouts, but youth unemployment would be if the Canova prescription were taken on a lot of things, that you would hope that would be the first thing it would work toward.
Well, unemployment in general, I mean, it's falling more heavily on young people, but we see at this point it has spread to people in their mid-career. Even people later in their careers have lost their jobs and are having a hard time. We're now facing the highest long-term unemployment since the Great Depression. We
are. The number on unemployment alone is 9%. By some people say that underemployment, which includes those who can't find full-time work or have given up, by your measure, you think it's as much as 1 in 5.
It's 1 in 5, 1 in 6.
And then when we talk about youth unemployment, it could hit the 20s or the 30s.
Or 30s,
so,
that's
and
right.
The long term, and it's people over 2 years in many instances.
That's right.
And you think one of the elixirs can be, and maybe one of the causes has been the actions of the Federal Reserve. Before we get into that, for the benefit, everyone knows of the Fed, the central bank. Background on the Federal Reserve here, and maybe compare it to central banks in other countries.
Sure. Well, the Federal Reserve was created almost 100 years ago. It acts as the lender of last resort. So it's the banker's bank, and it's run by bankers.
And a lender to the federal government itself, or a buyer of government securities.
Buyer of government securities, that's true. And the Federal Reserve is governed by a board of governors in Washington, D.C., 7 governors who are appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the U.S. Senate. But then in its policy-making committee, the Federal Open Market Committee, we have 12 regional Federal Reserve Bank presidents who are chosen by private bankers. So some would say the fox is running the hen house.
Okay, and we'll talk, there was a two GAO audits of the Fed, and we'll talk about the results of that, which you no doubt will be taking up in this committee. A very august committee, I should say. Joseph Stiglitz, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2001, Robert Reich, who was Labor Secretary, and a number of other names, Jeffrey Sachs, who's done a lot of work over in after the fall of the Soviet Union.
That's right.
So congratulations on that appointment, and you've met once already,
yes,
right?
Yes, we have.
So we look forward to what that committee comes up with, as I mentioned, appointed by the independent senator, Bernie Sanders from Vermont. Well, let's talk about our central bank first before we get into what I know you think are some of its failings. Germany's got the Bundesbank. There's the Bank of England. Countries like India and China, I mean, they all have that central bank apparatus.
That's true. And there's, of course, the European Central Bank, which represents the Eurozone as well. I'd say the trend in central banking throughout the world for the past few decades have been to follow the United States lead. And that means to have an independent central bank, a central bank that is independent of elected governments as far as on their day-to-day operations. The problem with what's happened with independence is what it's really come to mean is a central bank that becomes captured by Wall Street interests, by very large banking interests. And so it might be independent of the politicians, but it doesn't mean that it's a neutral arbiter.
And you would say that even in this country, the Federal Reserve has evolved to be independent, but back, say, when we had the Great Depression and coming out of it, really the Federal Reserve, you say, then took its cues from Congress. Well,
that's true. You know, Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve now, is known for writing about the Great Depression. And when you read any of his textbooks, any of his writings on the Great Depression, he really fails to mention this important fact. Throughout the entire 1940s, the Federal Reserve, as a practical matter, was not independent. It took its marching orders from the White House and the Treasury, and it was the most successful decade in American economic history. So, on the one hand, we bemoan the size of the deficit today. It's about 10% of gross domestic product. In the 1940s, it peaked at over 30% of GDP. Government spending, federal spending right now is about 25% of GDP. In the 1940s, it peaked at about 45% of GDP. But the Federal Reserve was required to purchase government securities in any amount and at any price, required to keep the interest rate, the yield on treasuries, at near zero. So we had lower interest rates in the 1940s. We also had better regulation of asset markets, so there were like margin requirements on those asset markets, so we didn't see bubbles develop. And we had a 1.2% unemployment rate by the end of the war.
Okay, so we're here to talk largely about what possible modifications it would be to the Federal Reserve, but overarching this is how to get this economy going.
Yes.
And you would say that despite, and we have the figures, we've spent trillions on stimulus, and we'll put President Bush in there to start.
Yeah.
We started out, we spent, there were rebate checks under President Bush. Yeah. $400, $800, $160 billion. The TARP program, I know that you were not a fan of, $450 billion. We had, under President Obama, of course, the first stimulus, almost $800 billion. And then the Federal Reserve, with its stimulus, I think we're at $2+ trillion with QE1, QE2, and Operation Twist. Yeah. Not enough, per Tim Canova.
It's not so much the volume as much as the makeup of the stimulus. So a lot of the stimulus, the fiscal stimulus that comes out of Congress, both in the Bush administration and the Obama administration, a lot of it is in the form of tax rebates and tax credits. And the fact is, in this economy, when you have such widespread unemployment, people are not going to run out and spend their rebates, their tax rebates on products.
They'll pay down debt, which they've done.
They'll pay down some debt. To the degree they buy goods, it might stimulate the Chinese economy more than the U.S. economy. There's a degree of hoarding and saving that goes on that doesn't necessarily get translated into investment. So tax rebates and tax credits are not the most effective stimulus at this point in history. There are times when tax cuts are very effective, but right now I don't find it to be the most effective.
And I think, I mean, so much of this is political, but I think here's one where you might even find some partisan agreement. I think looking at the current, and then there was a new stimulus proposal, a little less than $500 billion, not enough, and certainly in the prior ones, on infrastructure.
That's right. That's right. And that's really...
Why?
Because it was political. It was very easy for Obama to sell his stimulus package because a third of it was in tax cuts and tax rebates. Very little of it was actually in infrastructure spending. You know, when Roosevelt took office in 1933, in the first week he took office, there was the Civilian Conservation Corps that was passed, and within 90 days, 250,000 Americans were in the field with shovels, cutting fire lines, clearing underbrush, and putting out fires. And you know, we didn't have that same kind of approach. That the purpose of stimulus is actually to start putting people to work.
With all the talk of shovel-ready projects, it seems like that was the approach, and maybe it wasn't the right allocation.
I think it was a lot more talk than reality. And
so
just,
the execution was...
Well, I think the design of the plan was flawed. And, you know, just to get back to the Civilian Conservation Corps, in the past year, just this past summer, 4 million acres were scorched in this country. Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico saw the largest fires in their state's history. And at the peak, there'd be 2,000 or 3,000 firefighters.
So let's go back to the Federal Reserve. Its role, you thought, was a proper role and a useful role in the 1930s and 40s to help get us out of the recession. They've certainly been active. They've kept short-term rates to all but zero. They've provided liquidity where they could, first just to the corporate market and to the housing market. But you think that's not enough? They're too independent? How would you change what the Fed is doing?
Well, let's take a look at what the Fed really has done in the past 3 years. First of all, the Government Accountability Office audits, the GAO audits, the first audit showed that the Fed has extended a revolving fund of credit of $16 trillion to Wall Street firms and hedge funds. I mean, the volume of that is really mind-boggling, especially compared to what Main Street has gotten, which is a pittance compared to that.
It's hard to get a home loan as we sit here at the end of 2011.
That's right. So the banks are flush with a couple of $1 trillion in excess reserves that they're not lending out. So pushing monetary reserves...
But don't they have higher reserve requirements?
The reserve requirements aren't that high. The Fed is paying interest on the reserves, and maybe that's not so wise. So there might be things the Fed could do to try to encourage the banks to lend more, but it's still a matter of what was called in the 1930s by the Federal Reserve Chairman then, Mariner Eccles. He likened monetary policy to pushing on a string. When you've got such mass unemployment and such low demand and low confidence among consumers and among business people, monetary policy and bank lending is just not the most effective way to get the economy back up on its feet. Now, the second GAO audit showed many of the conflicts of interest that exist on the Federal Reserve regional boards of directors, sits many of the same bankers that were receiving some of the $16 trillion in loans, including Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan and other top executives. The other thing the Federal Reserve did in the past few years was the QE1 and the QE2 programs, the quantitative easing programs. So QE1, the Federal Reserve purchased $1.25 trillion of mortgage-backed securities from Wall Street firms and hedge funds. And in QE2, it purchased about $600 billion of Treasury securities from those same entities.
Ostensibly, again, to provide liquidity to the system and to drive up the stock market, which
well,
it did.
That's right.
And that made folks wealthier.
It might have made. That's not a Main Street strategy. It really isn't.
A lot of folks are in 401ks, as you know. When the Dow goes from 6,500 to 12,000, Tim, a lot of folks have more money. Now I know
how sustainable is that? The Fed has to keep pumping money into these banks if it's going to sustain this kind of a false stock market boom or recovery. The motivation of the Fed in doing this is quite clear, and we see this from the conflicts of interest. It's really to help the balance sheets of the big banks. It's taking assets off of their balance sheets that there wasn't a very good market for those assets at the time.
Right. In fact, we looked at actually buying those assets, the so-called toxic assets. And
you know, Paul Volcker, former Federal Reserve Chairman, in early 2008, before the collapse of Lehman, he said in the pages of the Wall Street Journal that he was troubled that the Fed was extending loans to big banks where the collateral was these mortgage-backed securities. And he said it really calls into question the independence of the Fed, that the Fed's no longer acting as socially neutral, that instead it is representing the interests of one entity or one sector of society, and that would be a financial sector.
But you're not just a critic. You are an idea man, and so let's get into those, because people hear a lot about what's wrong with the Fed, what's wrong with the country, we've lost our way, that used to be us, all that. So let's start. The Fed has, what is the Fed's mandate right now, and what would the Fed mandate be under Canova or under what you hope this advisory committee on Federal Reserve reform?
Well, the Fed's mandate stems from several acts of Congress over the years, from the 1940s and the 1970s. It's supposed to take care of maintaining a high level of employment consistent with price stability and moderate growth. It seems to have favored price stability over taking care of a decent level of employment. Now, to change the Fed's mandate, what would it look like? I would say the Fed, first of all, needs to be reformed at the governing level so that it does represent a wider variety of society's interests and not just the interests of large bankers that sit on its governing boards, its regional Federal Reserve Bank boards. In addition to restructuring the governing of the Fed, it should be given the policy tools to deal with this very unique economic crisis. It's really a once-in-a-century crisis. Now, what kind of policy tools? I mentioned the quantitative easing programs for Wall Street. It would be nice to have a quantitative easing program for Main Street.
How would that work?
Well, the beauty of the quantitative easing programs, first of all, is that those $2 trillion that the Fed pumped into the banks, that's newly created money. It's done by computer these days, but it doesn't add a penny to the national deficit or the debt. So, you know, that solves a big problem. Now, the dean at my law school, Tom Campbell, PhD in economics from University of Chicago, studied under Milton Friedman, a brilliant law professor. He's come out with a proposal that what we should be doing to stimulate this economy is rebating employers half the cost of a new employee, half the salary for a year of a new employee. And I think he has modeled it out that 6 million people hired at the prevailing wages in this country would cost about $175 billion. And the unique part of his proposal was he would have the Federal Reserve pay for that.
I was just going to say, because the first response is, where does the money come from? Right. From the federal government on down. Governments are belly up. It's been a record year for municipal bankruptcies, but this comes from the Federal Reserve.
That's right. That's right. And Tom Campbell is coming from the right side of the spectrum. People who are coming from the middle or the left side of the spectrum would say, hey, let's have a quantitative easing program paid for by the Federal Reserve, not the taxpayer, but instead of rebating salaries to employers, let's have some public works programs. Let's do some infrastructure.
We'll get there, but just one other quick rejoinder to that is 50% rebate job hiring credit. If companies are going to hire, they're going to do it anyway. Isn't it just a giveaway? And two, they're not going to hire if there's no demand, which you hear a lot from business.
I agree with you, and that's why I do part company with Tom Campbell on that. I do think it would be more effective to have a quantitative easing program that is directly putting people to work building infrastructure.
You have some other ideas. You point to, and you're a big believer in the government being an active, if not a leading participant in the economy. And let's start with that. Conventional wisdom is the private sector will lead us out of this no longer recession, but this slow growth. We're at 2.5%. You think the government does?
Well, let's look at history. The government sector is what led us out of the Great Depression with wartime spending. I'm not advocating big wartime spending. We have to find other things to spend money on. After World War II, what drove this economy? The space program led to all kinds of technological spin-offs and computerization. The internet wasn't invented by Al Gore or Bill Gates. That was a Defense Department program. It came out of DARPA. You know, every time we use our cell phones and we start texting, we should be thanking Uncle Sam.
I thought you were going to say thank Uncle Al. But let's talk about the government, and it's quite obvious. You're coming in from the left side of the spectrum. People who favor more government action tend to be on the left side of the spectrum. But you look at things like infrastructure, the recent pipeline project, we know we want more energy independence, and it's a lot of folks on the left, maybe you call them environmentalists, a lot of folks who favor a lot of bureaucracy and regulation that are preventing things from the pipeline project.
Of course, we have to find ways to make these projects happen that in ways that don't destroy the environment, but actually enhance the environment, that become a more energy efficient infrastructure. You know, you mentioned right and left, and I think right and left has gotten very confused in recent years. So we see the outsourcing of infrastructure, where the San Francisco Bay Bridge is constructed in China and then assembled here. You know, it's people on the right of the spectrum, more than the left, who have been for this free trade experiment with the People's Republic of China. You know, that doesn't really comport with how we dealt with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We seem to be hanging ourselves by trading with a country that we cannot really trust in economic relations the way we should be able to.
Go back to the public sector leading. You point to North Dakota as an example, and by the way, the Dakotas have the lowest unemployment rate. Now, nothing happens in a vacuum. They also have had a big oil find.
That's true, but their neighbors like Montana and Wyoming that have lots of natural resources don't have the same kind of low unemployment rate. The Bank of North Dakota has been around for almost 100 years. It has a big part of the student loan market. The earnings that it makes, it rebates to the state treasury, and that's about $330 million over the past decade. And for a state the size of North Dakota, that's a lot of money. But let's not just look at North Dakota. The Germans, the Chinese, they've all been using state-owned, publicly owned infrastructure banks very effectively.
Different charter, less a profit and shareholder beholden to that, and more for the greater good, or certainly the provincial good of their state.
it's cost effective to say the least. Those are economic powerhouses. Germany is the largest exporter, has the largest trade surplus in the world. China is second place to them. These countries, we should think, what are they doing that maybe we should be doing?
Just a couple of minutes ago, Tim, your committee has met once. Take us through what is going to be the process, and if you had to guess, what kind of recommendations and what weight would they have?
Well, it's too early to know exactly what will come out of this. What Bernie Sanders wants is advice on how to reform the governing structure of the Fed and whether the Fed's mandate should be amended, enhanced in some way, so that the Federal Reserve can take the lead in responding to this economic crisis. Now, Sanders is perceived and is on the left in the U.S. Senate, but he's worked very effectively with people across the spectrum. You know, those GAO audits that ended up in the final Dodd-Frank Act, that was thanks to Bernie Sanders, and it passed the U.S. Senate by a 96-0 vote. The time for changing the Fed is now. For years, I've been talking about the need for reform of the Fed, and a lot of us have been, and we've been marginalized in the discussions in many ways. I think right now it's a moment in time where that position, reforming the Fed, is actually the moderate, sensible position. You've got on the extreme right and the Fed. Now, there's Ron Paul.
His book.
That's right. And Ron Paul is very lucid in much of his critique of the Fed. I don't begrudge him that. But just getting away with any central bank.
Exact opposite, I think. They're a linchpin, actually. As poorly constructed as you think they are, they're a linchpin to your plan.
Yes, they are. And it's hard to imagine a well-functioning economy without a central bank. So I think the end the Fed is a bit radical. But I'd also say the status quo is radical and corrupt.
So if everyone's looking around these days, we know there are a number of ills to the economy for a magic bullet. And if there was one, you would think it starts with the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, I do think so. I think Federal Reserve reform has to come before much else.
Tim Canova is a past assistant dean here at the Chapman University Law School. He's a longtime Chapman professor of economic law and newly named member to a really august committee, the Advisory Committee on Federal Reserve Reform. Always a pleasure to chat with you, Tim. Appreciate it. A lot more. Come back.
Thank you.
Do it again.
Very much. I would love to.
And Happy New Year to you, my friend.
To you too.
A prosperous 2012 to us all. Stay tuned. We got our great student feature story straight ahead. A look back, actually, at one of the giants of Orange County sports that we lost in 2011. Former Cal State Fullerton football coach Gene Murphy. Tara Skipper has a great tribute. Please stay tuned for that. Welcome back to the Chapman Business Report. Time for our great student feature stories. Quick look back at 2011. We lost a giant of Orange County sports. If you've grown up in this area, you know one of the real gentlemen back in the day when we had Division I football was Gene Murphy, who coached Cal State University Fullerton football with minimal resources. But the best part is he was a true gentleman, a great guy, and broadcast journalism student Tara Skipper takes this look at the late Gene Murphy.
1,000 people crowded into St. Juliana Catholic Church on November 7th to celebrate the life of former Cal State Fullerton football coach Gene Murphy. The beloved coach passed away on October 29th after undergoing surgery for cancer of the esophagus 4 days earlier. He was 72 years old. Friends and family wore green in honor of Murphy's Irish heritage, a request made by Murphy before his passing. Murphy coached the Cal State Fullerton Titans for 13 years, up until the football program was cut due to financial troubles in 1992. Coach Murphy led the Titans to consecutive Pacific Coast Athletic Association titles in 1983 and 84, and led the school to its only bowl appearance in 83. Murphy coached future pro players and mentored big names like Steve Mariucci, Tom Cable, and Hugh Jackson, who all worked as assistant coaches under Murphy.
Gene Murphy, the Cal State Fullerton coach.
Gee, we enjoyed talking with him. What a colorful guy.
Yeah, he is.
Murphy was inducted into Cal State Fullerton's Hall of Fame in 2009. Former colleague and close friend of Murphy's, Steve DeTola, is the Senior Associate Athletic Director at Fullerton, and he remembers Murphy for a lot more than his accomplishments on the field.
He was probably the most unselfish man that I've ever known. His players always came first. His assistant coaches always came first. His staff always came first. As good a coach as he was a better human being. He cared more about people, and he will sincerely be missed, not only by the Titan family, but the community of Fullerton as well.
From Fullerton, I'm Tara Skipper for Chapman News.
All right, thanks to Tara for that report. It sure stands in stark contrast to what we see in collegiate sports today, right? And my thanks to Dr. Tim Canova for his terrific insights on the economy, his contentions about reforming the Federal Reserve. We'll have him back very soon to see how his advisory committee on reforming the Fed is making out. As always, to Jeff Cole Productions, class of 2001, Jeff Cole, his crew puts on the Chapman Report. Dan Duran, Ryan Westra for their terrific camera work. Thank you very much for watching. Let's hope 2012 is a great year, and we surely appreciate your patronage. I'm Pete Weitzner. We'll see you next week on the Chapman Business Report.
Funding for this program was provided by Chapman University.